I was around 8 years old when I realized, as did my family, that I had a unique memory. Photographic, they called it. It's really nothing like a photograph, though. I always assumed everyone could recall their first day of preschool, the names of the kids they met only once at the arcade. But at 11 years old, my sister Cammie was chosen for a game show on the radio. Without hesitation, she chose me as her roommate to bring with. She could have chosen either of our parents, even our older brother Charlie, who was in college. She could have picked one of her friends, 8th graders like her. But she chose me. I remember sitting around the kitchen table, eating dinner, the pitch-black Midwestern winter night just outside the giant kitchen window behind my dad. He and my mom were totally supportive of the idea. He had offered even to drive us to the radio station. "I would have chosen you too, Bobby," my mom said, laughing. "You remember every weird fact ever." And it was true. I could close my eyes and see every house my parents had ever brought us to. I could draw the floor plan of them if I wanted to. My siblings would ask me to retell stories or movie plots on long car rides. But it wasn't until the radio show, and my sister choosing me as her person, that I knew I had something special. I can still remember going to bed that night after dinner, feeling excited. I finally fell asleep, pressed up against the wall that divided me from my sister's room, her voice through the vents above my bed, saying good night like she did every night. The smell of dust on the furnace, the sound of old creaking boards directly above me in the attic. It was the last night I was happy to have my amazing memory. To this day, I wish I could forget what happened next. I wish I could tell you we won the game show. I wish I could tell you with incredible detail what it was like at the studio. Maybe then, when I close my eyes, that's what I would see. Not the black, whipping night blurring past me as I ran. I would feel the rush of anticipation and my sister's hand squeezing mine, instead of cold, wet gravel scraping my cheeks and palms when I tried to crawl away on 2 sprained ankles. I would hear the producers cue the canned audience laughter, not the frantic, desperate flapping of leather wings as they neared. Maybe I would have won a t-shirt that still sits in my dresser. Maybe my sister would have won the $1,000 prize. Maybe I would sleep with my door unlocked. I'll never know. What I do know, without a shadow of a doubt, is that I would not have survived any of this if my family hadn't believed me. To this day, it's the thing I am most grateful for in the entire world. It was the day after dinner, on Tuesday, February 17th. School had been agonizingly slow, as I knew it would be all week waiting for Friday. It was all we could talk about on the way home. For years, I'd waited for school with Yuki and my best friend Dominic, who lived on the street perpendicular to mine. The creek crossed under Sistrine Drive and wound its way along Dominic's backyard. There are hundreds of childhood memories in my head, of he and I and our siblings jumping over the creek, building bridges from his yard over the creek to the field behind the rec center, sliding on the ice in the winter, or half-assed fishing and turtle catching in the summer. I always envied my friends who could walk right from their backyard and into the little winding creek. It was cold, but it hadn't snowed in a few weeks. There were still some small patches of ice on the sidewalk, but most of it had melted, along with the slurry gray mounds of stale snow along the curbs and in small scattered patches on the grass. There was massive construction happening on the other side of the creek. They were building a stupid business center on the field we used to play kickball in, the crane visible between 2 houses behind us. Snow was due that weekend, and everything would be coated and beautiful again. The downside of a blanket of snow was the eerie quiet it caused, and how hard it was to sleep at night when the moonlight and the snow were so bright, even with your closed eyes. It was nearly 6 p.m., and the mid-February sky was already darkening. We had stopped under the flickering gold streetlight at the corner of Citrine and Amethyst, the street that I lived on. I remember huddling close in a group, talking. I remember the wind picking up and the edge of the sky glowing purple behind the house along Citrine. This was when my oldest brother, on break for 1 more week, drove up to the corner in Mom's old sedan. "Hey, Bobby," he called, giving my friends a little wave that they all returned. He was returning some jeans to the mall and wanted me to come with him. It was rare that Charlie asked me to do anything. I think about that a lot. Had he paid more attention to me before that night, would I have gotten in the car? Would things have been different? I think about all the choices I made that led to that happening, but none as much as the decision to get in the car with my older brother instead of walking home that evening. Maybe I wouldn't sleep in my closet. Maybe I'd have a family of my own. I'll never know. Then again, maybe I would have never seen Charlie again. If you asked, I could tell you every moment on that trip to the mall. The conversation we had, mainly Charlie asking if things fit him or were flattering. Charlie had come out to our parents a few months ago. They were not surprised or fazed. He had told me that night that he had gone to the bar and felt underdressed, and now he felt pressured to be fashionable. The last thing Charlie said to me before we got in the damn car was, "It's funny, even if you're different, there's still pressure to be the same." At 8:53 p.m. on Tuesday, February 17th, 1998, Charlie and I were on the front seat of our mother's 1995 maroon Lamino. We were at the final stop sign on the ride home, and it was 38 degrees outside. Pearl Jam's Tin was in the CD player, and we were at the corner of Pondside and Citrine, about to turn left into our neighborhood, and to home, to be with our family. Our mother had lasagna waiting for us. We were third in line at the three-way stop sign. On Charlie's side of the street was Yuki's house, with pretty lanterns lining the paved path to the courtyard of their U-shaped ranch home. On my side, past my window, was the pond. The path that led around the pond and up the hill was bright at the edge from the streetlights, but quickly faded to black, with only the occasional twinkle of a back porch light in the distance. The remains of the moon tower, built in the 70s, were barely discernible against the sky, only via the absence of stars and the shape of the structures that was only recognizable to those of us who grew up there. It was a scene that had made me feel small and afraid countless times. The cold radiating from the windows made me feel even more anxious, though now I realized that it was the adrenaline, an ancient alarm system going off in my bloodstream, survival mode manifesting in goosebumps, and what I mistook for heebie-jeebies. The black of the moon tower against the blue-black of the sky shifted as my eyes started to adjust. I had thought about a sleepover game Dominic and I had played when we were in 3rd grade, staring at each other's faces in the dark until they morphed and changed and threw us into giggle fits. It wasn't until the bottom left star above the hill disappeared that I realized it wasn't my eyes playing tricks on me. It wasn't until the pitch grew larger that I opened my mouth to say something. Charlie was deep in the chorus of Even Flow and never heard it coming. It was a low whistle, like an old man out for a walk. 2 notes, one high, one low. It repeated again, louder, and I'd turned to tell Charlie when I saw the red light of the brake lights on the car in front of us fade from his face, and he finally saw what was coming. Only, it hadn't come from the pitch black over the pond. It came from the other side, slamming into the driver's side of the car in front of us. It shattered the glass into a hailstorm, crashing onto our windshield. The impact was so intense that both left wheels had lifted off the ground. Charlie initially cursed loudly and went to open the door to help. I'd screamed at him not to, but I barely got a word out before a penetrating silent vacuum filled the air around me, sucking the air out of my lungs. Seconds later, my windows were shattered over me, glass sticking in my cheeks and the wind whipping the blood across my face and into my mouth as I screamed. I knew before I opened my eyes that it wasn't just an accident, that there was no car or bike or even human assailant. I knew before I pried my eyes open that everything I had feared as a child, that all the myths and legends and ghost stories, were real. I knew it wasn't a bat or a bird. I knew as I felt frantic claws at the nylon remains of my seatbelt that it was a monster. Not a cute storybook monster, but an ancient, angry, bitter creature. One that had been there long before I had, or the town had, or even people had. The last thing I saw before I felt the hook sink into my shoulder and I was lifted into the black, swirling cold was Charlie, slumped over the steering column, Eddie Vinder's voice still calling out to me, until I couldn't hear him anymore. Not for 1 second did I think it was a dream. The cold made sure of that. My legs heavily dragged across the broken glass of the car window, ripping my jeans and slamming my legs into the frame. I knew it was real. The biting night sky whipped around me as I violently sank a few feet as the hooks in my shoulder began to slip. I experienced a new level of pain as I felt jagged talons piercing my side, and I folded forward as I was yanked backwards into the pitch. I felt another agonizing piercing on the side of my torso before being yanked up away from the earth and everything I'd ever known. I was pulled into the pitch past the streetlights, but whatever had me was struggling. I fell 20 feet onto the icy hard gravel path, but wasn't freed. Violent metallic screams flooded my ears, and the bones of my forehead and chin were scraped along the gravel path. I desperately clawed at the earth, trying to find anything to grip, but only found fistfuls of gravel and goose crap. The talons in my side ripped out suddenly, and I felt a sickening oozing from my sides. I tried to roll over to my knees, but the pain on each side was horrible, and I felt bile swelling in my throat. A patch of dirty snow was inches away, and I tried to crawl towards it to get some ice on my bleeding injuries. That was when I felt leathery whips on my face and violent snags in my hair, pulling and snapping. My stomach lurched as again I was yanked up into the night, higher into my own icy black death. I tried desperately to grasp onto whatever had me, terrified to fall as we climbed higher. The cold stung my raw shoulders and hips, and I felt my blood freezing. The deep scrapes on my knees and face burned with the wind, feeling like icy razors scraping my cheekbones. My numb fingers found a thick, velvety limb. Coarse hair bristled and slipping under my blood. 6 daggers dug into my skull and neck. Even over the roar of the wind and the pounding of the wings, I could hear a horrible scraping and squealing of claws on my skull from behind. From the inside. I struggled to breathe, blood and vomit filling my mouth and tears threatening to suffocate me. Suddenly, the little air that I had on my lungs was forced out violently as my midsection was slammed into the highest beam of the moon tower. The crunching of my ribs was unmistakable. My vision and even my own thoughts darkened with what I can only describe as wetness. Later, I would be told that my ribs were so violently broken that they had pierced my lungs. For a moment, the moon illuminated my nightmares. I was nauseatingly high up, one eye swollen shut, but I could see the frozen pond, dull and distant. Closer, I could see a row of houses, their windows glowing but cruelly out of each. One house still had its Christmas lights up, complete with a giant light-up plastic mold Santa Claus tied to their chimney. It felt wrong and cruel, a warm and happy impossibility. I looked down to see a stream of my blood pouring from my body in a steady flow, then broken by an aggressive gust of icy wind. I choked on a scream, and I was grabbed again, talons stretching out of the exit wound in my shoulder, birthing brand new ones on my lower back. I couldn't hear my own screams over the wind and the angry metallic shrieks like barbed wire on a rusted trampoline. I remember at this point I could see the pond shrinking south of me as once again my host struggled with its prey. Suddenly we dropped right above the creek, my legs slamming into the fence surrounding the construction site. The cranes loomed over us, the 2 security floodlights at its base finally providing light. The construction site was deep in the ground, a parking garage with a basement level built to be tornado-proof. I've heard countless times from other people with violent experiences Did they forget chunks of their trauma, or they blacked it out? I try not to seethe with jealousy. If I could forget any of it, I would want to forget what I saw under those garish white construction lights. I can remember every tiny, ice-cold pebble digging into my skin, the shimmering bouquet of my tear-soaked lashes, the gritty, jagged pain of my pulverized rib bones. I remember the smell, a mix of cold sweat, like when our dad would come home after his jog, diesel, blood. There was another smell coming from the base of the crane, sickly sweet, like almond extract gone bad. Behind the crane was a trailer. The paneling was beige and a huge green tin sign that read, Argon Construction. I thought for a moment that a phone might be inside. I pulled myself up onto my knees and looked around. It was difficult since my left eye was useless, and my right one was full of tears and blood. My assailant was nowhere in sight. I thought that maybe it had gotten injured or caught on a fence. Stupid. I know now that it simply was rousing its companions, because it was dinner time. I was an offering, like when my cat Nala would bring me dead robins. Here I was, with my wings clipped. I was halfway to the trailer, limping as fast as I could, every step excruciating, breathing like there were pins and needles in me. Even with my sobbing hyperventilation, I heard it. I hear it now. I can always hear it. The two-toned whistle, haunting and dreadful, like even if I hadn't been at death's door, that tone would still have shaken me, like a doomsday alarm, like useless sirens wailing as meteors crash into the boiling sea. Under the whistle, a thick, wet breath, echoing from beneath the base of the crane, a dark recess in the cold, wet ground, with darkness somehow leaking from it. Darkness so black that only a staccatoed stream was visible. Something was breathing. I wish I could tell you that the construction unearthed something ethereal, a beautiful sleeping giant, an angel, a groundbreaking discovery. But I don't even think it was the construction. I just think she had always been there. Maybe for years she had survived on squirrels or deer. Maybe she thawed during the warm winter. Maybe she was left behind. The first thing I saw was the tattered, jagged tips of wings, bat-like, narrow, dark-veined like bruised plum skin, her pulse visibly pumping through the veins that raised and ripped through the paper-thin skin, stretching over her wings so tightly it seemed painful just to exist, like she wasn't finished yet, like she'd been birthed from the earth prematurely, and she was angry. Her hair was matted in clumps, but where it was free, it was long enough to drag along the ground, slimy and cold and full of dirt, leaves, and dirty snow. Her scalp was suffering. I could see her follicles piercing her scalp, like deceased plant roots, bulbous and swollen. Open sores at her hairline showed what I can only stomach to explain as insect activity. Layers of sick, sheer skin being actively eaten away by a miasma, forehead wrinkles deep and scarred in places. She had no eyebrows or lashes that I could see from my crouched hiding position. Her nose was just a cavity, like a Halloween skull, also swarming with parasites. When she breathed in, a flap rippled across her face, the wetness dripping over her mouth. Her mouth! Years later, an art teacher had told me that while he enjoyed my monstrous horror drawings, that even special effects departments had boundaries, and I would be unlikely to get hired if I didn't tone it down or attempt to make them more realistic. If only he had known I was following his rules, drawing what I knew. She had the familiar sagging of a toothless old woman with flat, cracked, corpse-like lips. But then she parted them. The rot was dizzying. Her gums had been clawed away, scabs and scars and thick bands of roped grayish mauve flesh. Her top and bottom jawbones were not simply bared. They were jagged, layered razors, filed, but not with anything modern or sharp or particularly clean. Time, madness, desperation had filed and shaped that nightmare maw. Makeshift teeth of rocks had been maniacally shoved under the skin, adhered with infection and growth. The entire left side of her face was worn through layer by layer. Her tongue slipped in and out of what could have been her throat, sharp, gaunt collarbones literally piercing through that tissue-like skin, dark, rancid blood pooling in the deep recesses of her collar. She had one misshapen breast. The left side of her chest was deeply scarred and textured, as though it had been burned. Her fingers were bones with jagged talons blackened at the tips. Thick scar tissue marred her shoulders, where her wings took her from somewhat humanoid to monstrous. Scars. Scars everywhere. Rotting wounds dripping larvae and blood onto the frozen ground. I wish I could forget the momentary warmth I felt as urine poured down my legs, immediately freezing and burning, sticking my jeans to my raised and bloody shins. I tore myself away from staring at her long enough to escape. She had chosen her feeding place well. The deep recess of the site was the length of a football field, since that's what the field had once been. High walls of frozen earth surrounded us on three sides. Climbing up in my condition would be impossible. There was a ramp at the far entrance, but I wouldn't have made it past her. Only behind me was the fence I had slammed into on the way in, the creek only a few yards from that, and then a row of backyards of houses that included Dominic's. I had cried then. I cried thinking that only a few minutes away, my best friend was probably getting ready for bed. Then he would always remember the night before he woke up to find out his best friend was dead. He had no idea that my blood was spilling all over the place that we had run and played in. He was warm, with his own mom just feet away. I sobbed, thinking of my own mother. It wasn't the idea of her finding out too, or knowing I would never see her again. It was the guttural, instinctual, painful need for her. It was like being too far underwater and being out of breath, kicking as fast as you can, but knowing you couldn't make it. I needed her, but wouldn't make it to the surface. To her. My sobbing had given me away. That horrible metallic sound reverberated around me, and I remember I was being fed. She was feeding me to something. I had taken a deep breath, bracing myself for the pain, and made for the fence. Before my feet even hit the ground, her claws were in my neck. She flung me further from the trailer and onto the fresh cement that had been poured during the warmer months. I gave up. I'll be honest. I accepted that I was going to die. Then I had heard something unexpected and sickening. Small, furtive movements. Unmistakable vocalizations. Even just from primal grunting and wet groans. I knew it was her young, and I knew it was human. I felt her toxic breath on me before I realized that she had moved. She paused for a second, mapping the wounds she had inflicted so that she could use them again as grips. That was when she dug in so deep into the opening in my shoulder that I could feel her nails and her fingers deep inside the wound. She flung me further across the cement, closer to the sickening, furtive movements. I squeezed my eyes shut. I smelled rancid organic decay and the unmistakable odor of feces. I felt small, fluttering fingers on my neck. Small, little, childlike. I made the inevitable mistake of opening my eyes. I saw dirty blonde hair, tinged with green, draped across a tiny face. Human feet. Baby feet. He was maybe 3, dirty and small, His fingernails were long and sharpened to points. He smiled, and thick mucus stretched across several blackened, sharp teeth. He was missing some, but what remained were crooked, stained and diseased, stuck in purple, rotten gums. Instead of chubby, rosy cheeks, he had hollow, sunken gray skin. The bags under his eyes were purple and veined. Instead of bright, youthful eyes, these were haunted orbs, devoid of color. Faded, milky irises deformed around dark, soulless pupils. He wore what had once been pajamas. Under layers of blood and grime, little trains chugged across his small body in a pattern. The sobs had returned from their hiding place in my chest. I had felt the need to comfort this small, broken doll of a child. That's when he lunged, his broken teeth sinking into my forearm. The pain was unbelievable, bright and loud like the headlights of a truck barreling down on you. I pulled away and heard a horrifying squelching sound as my forearm flesh ripped and hung from his tiny, plump lips. I gagged as he hungrily shoved my skin into his mouth. He ran to the monster, clinging to her body, his stubby hands sinking into her rotten fruit skin. I held my hand tightly against my forearm, watching the blood spill in tributaries between my fingers. It began to snow. Tiny, delicate laceworks fell into and melted against the steaming pool of blood at my feet. A disgusting gurgling sound brought me back, and I watched in horror as the little boy nursed from his mother's surviving breast. Thick blood spilled from the side of his mouth as she gently swept the hair from his face. Years later, I would look up the missing children's database online. I would narrow my search to my state, select the birth year, clumsily guess at the date missing, and it would take me 6 days and 2 breakdowns, but I would find him, along with an inaccurate age progression picture. His parents had named him Mason. He was a twin. He had a baby sister and a dog. He went missing from a family camping trip when he and his brother were 1. But I didn't know any of that when I watched him wash down my flesh with bloody breast milk from a demon I hadn't known existed a few hours earlier. Hours earlier, I'd been at the mall, for Christ's sake. The mall with Charles. I guess remembering my brother's body hanging limply across the steering column had jarred me into action. Knowing he wasn't even a football field away from me got me moving. If I could get over the fence, I could make a beeline for Dominic's backyard. I would just have to jump over the mostly frozen creek to get there. Then I could run to his parents' window and have them call the police. I could see the yellow square in the dark that was the sliding glass door to their kitchen from where I was. If I ran through their house as a shortcut, I could run down their driveway, straight down my street to my house. My heart broke a little as I thought of my parents and my sister beginning to worry about us, as we were only a block away fighting for our lives. But if I got to the far end of the fence before the inclined up, I could get to Charles and keep him safe, keep him warm and talking until the ambulance arrived. Surely somebody had called. The impact on the car was so loud. The other driver surely had a car phone or maybe a cell phone. Maybe even Yuki's Aikido puppy Moki had heard and was barking up a storm. Maybe the police were already there. For a moment, I thought about grabbing the boy, even if he bit me. I could carry him on my back and get him as far away from her as I could. Maybe even get him home to his family. But even as I stood there, I could barely hold myself up. The world had started to spin around me, blood thickly but steadily pooling on my shoes, my bra, and at the top of my jeans. A few feet from my right lay a rubble pile, not large, but mainly chunks of rebar and concrete. I'd barely made a few inches of progress towards it when a metallic screech again assaulted my senses. My hands covered my ears. I shuffled towards the pile and grabbed a chunk of the rubble, a crude, misshapen, and awkward hammer to wield against the impossible enemy. A rusted, twisted metal handle with a heavy and uneven weight of concrete, hard to hold and even harder to swing. But it was all I had, and I knew it only had to get to the weakest part of her. I only had to incapacitate her long enough to get within earshot of Dominic's house. It couldn't be much past 10 p.m. Someone would have to hear me. I gripped my shoddy weapon tightly to my chest with both hands and felt her swoop down violently as I dove for a cement tunnel, her empty-handed dive throwing her off balance. I scrambled awkwardly towards the far end of the tunnel as I heard her raspy wings pulling her upward before her second strike. Instead of waiting for her to cut me off at the tunnel, I ran as fast as I could, darting from the opening and towards the sickly sweet smell of her nest. The only thing between the fence and me was a bloody baby boy. Blood swirled in my mouth, and a gritty, sharp feeling forced me to spit. I don't know why the image of my tooth and my hand covered in blood triggered a response in me, but it did. I knew I was dying, not just that I was going to die, that this monster my parents had never imagined in their worst nightmares would take their daughter away forever, and they would never see my body or have anything to bury, but that I currently was actively dying. The damage to my ribs, my lungs, my spleen, my arm would kill me if the blood loss or hypothermia didn't do it first. I knew I was dying, and it turned me into a monster too. I ran, not straight for the fence, but for her nest. I could hear her above me, barreling down. I ran right towards that little boy and swung a 20-pound chunk of concrete down on his tiny hand, smashing it to the ground. The sound he made wakes me up at night sometimes. His screams were animal-like, and dropped my weapon to cover my ears. The rusted metal scream from the sky crashed down like a bomb, and I ran. I didn't look back. I ran to the fence. With all the strength I had left, I pulled myself up, shoving my foot into a diamond-shaped hole made by the chain link. I'd hopped 1,000 fences this way in my life, and to this day I'm grateful I had the experience. My bleeding hands found the frozen horizontal pipe at the top of the fence, and groaned in pain as I hefted myself over. All the fence-hopping experience in the world wouldn't have made climbing with shattered ribs and bleeding flanks any less impossible, and I could only crash to the ground. Both ankles jarred into the frozen ground, and my scream stuck in my throat, caught on blood and bile, escaping only as a choking sob. Her violent, crazed screams were still on the ground as she tended to her baby. I didn't let guilt slow me down. I ran as fast as I could for maybe 6 feet before my ankles gave out. Dominic's house was all I could see, a tunnel of black closing in on my vision. I never looked back. I gripped my fingers into the frosty ground, pulling myself up. I hobbled, sprinting towards the dark field. The night sky above me swirled with snow flurries. My busted, bloody fingers fumbled at my jacket zipper. I could see the flickering blue glow of the late-night TV coming from Mr. and Mrs. Rossi's bedroom. The tunnel grew smaller, and I could see less and less. Bawling, I forced my arms out of the jacket as I reached the banks of the creek. Dominic and I had spent summers of our childhood testing the width of the creek along its entirety, and I knew that the bend behind his house was not jumpable. My toes slipped over the crest of the land, and a razor-sharp talon slashed at my hands. I screamed and swung my jacket into the writhing storm of limbs and wings above me. Feeling solid impact on one of the swings, I let go of the jacket and flung myself across the frozen creek, landing with about a foot left, my feet crushing through the glass-thin ice as my ankles crumbled beneath me. I could only see a pinhole in front of me, a flickering blue of TV light. I could hear her above me, diving down, finally, for the kill, her metallic scream and the deafening boom of Mr. Rossi's handgun, the one I'd never even known he had. He was standing on the back porch, one hand over his head, gun pointed to the sky. Mrs. Rossi stood next to me, Dominic's baseball hat in her hand. The last thing I saw was the golden warm glow of the Rossi's kitchen, and the pinhole closing as the world darkened around me. I've read the statement Mr. and Mrs. Rossi gave the police, that they heard what they thought were animal noises behind the house, but when they opened the back door, they heard human screams as well. They saw a large, dark shape in the night, but only a second later they saw my body slumped over, my fingers barely making it to their property. They had called 911, and then my parents. The ambulance had brought my brother and the other driver to the hospital, and it only arrived 30 minutes before mine did. My dad had run to the Rossi's house while my poor, confused, frantic mother rode to the hospital with Cammy and our neighbor. When my dad and I recently recalled the events of that night, I cried hearing the usual funny, goofy man choke up, remembering seeing me slumped over Mrs. Rossi like a rag doll, her white robe covered in my blood. He said that my face was so bruised and swollen that he thought an animal had mauled me. He wasn't exactly wrong. Mr. Rossi had stood guard with the bat until the police and EMTs arrived. Animal control didn't press me too hard. In fact, the vaguer and foggier my memory was, the happier they seemed. I knew that if I told the truth, I'd be locked up, medicated, or assumed to be a victim of something else. A monster woman from the sky. Before I could have even said it out loud, I knew better and feigned memory loss. To this day, the official story is 2 cars on Pondside were struck by a wild animal, and the passenger of one of the cars was attacked and dragged by the animal until a neighbor heard the commotion and fired a gun, scaring it off. While I was in the hospital, a handful of flowers, candles, and teddy bears were left at the stop sign. Charlie doesn't remember anything. He says the last thing he can recall is running to the car in the parking lot and turning the heat on, before pulling the car around for me. I'm actually happy this is the last thing that he remembers. I wonder if he's telling the truth, though. Cammy would come in my room at night for years. She would sit on the floor next to my bed with her fuzzy Disney blanket wrapped around her shoulders. She knew the whole story from beginning to end, even about Mason, a detail I had kept from my parents. Cam and I would stay up together until the sun came up, our eyes locked on the windows in my room, the one facing the south. Some nights, she would get in bed with me, both of us sitting with our backs against the wall, our shoulders resting on one another's, both of us looking at the window, scanning every inch of the blue-gray pitch until morning's first light, searching for a growing speck of black. My parents, proud pacifists, had purchased a gun each, and a few years later they had Cammy and I in judo classes. But the best thing they did was believe me. Even that first night, after the first surgery, they had listened intently, never interrupting or telling me I was imagining things or lying. However, it was made very clear that while our home was a safe space, we weren't to talk about it outside the walls. I know she's still out there. I know Mason is too. Even after I moved away, my mom would send newspaper articles, first clippings in the mail, then eventually links in text messages as time went on. Police blotters about animal attacks, missing dogs, unexplained accidents, missing blonde boys. She took one every few years from different areas, and I thought initially maybe she had killed or eaten Mason once he was too old, until I saw them both one night. I'd heard the whistle, and I didn't even need to look up, but I did. But that's a story for another time. I always wanted to be a writer, ever since I was in 2nd grade. Over the course of my life, I got pretty good at it. Even got to the point where companies were paying me large salaries to take their ideas and turn them into stories and ad campaigns. By the time I was 30, I generated millions of dollars, spun up a portfolio that could land me any job, and made a name for myself in professional writing circles. But there was one thing I was missing: the ability to come up with good ideas. Now, you may think that in my position, that didn't matter much. Companies gave me the ideas, I brought them to life, and I made a lot of money doing it. Why did my lack of ideas really matter? They mattered because money didn't matter to me. Ideas did. I didn't want to be a professional writer. I wanted to be a creative one. I wanted to tell stories that chilled my readers, turned their stomach, broke their hearts. I wanted to create characters that men secretly cried over, and women openly lusted over in their book clubs. I wanted to paint settings that kept children up at night and drove movie producers crazy. I wanted to be the best storyteller. The only way to do that was to come up with winning ideas. But I didn't have any, so I looked for them in prompt workbooks. I even stole them from other authors' stories. I went to the workshops and watched as my peers spent their time while I stared at blank papers and laptop screens. Nothing worked. My ideas were either soft and boring or unrealistic and uncompelling. Nothing that I conceived begged to be brought to life on the page, and when I forced them out, they always seemed to droop over as if they were empty bags without skeletons or muscles. They were husks without any of the human stuff that held a real person up. Unlike me, they didn't even have the disappointment or self-pity to stand on their own. I was 35 when my pathetic inability to come up with ideas finally overwhelmed me. I didn't remember exactly what caused it, but I was on my way home from yet another writing workshop with the local Writers Guild when I decided that my life had grown meaningless. I was going home to craft a story, and if I couldn't do it, I was going to take my own life. That, I decided, was at least a creative story that someone would remember. You might suspect that the ultimatum gave me a sense of fear, but for the first time in my life, something clicked. There were stakes, and I felt the strange brush of a story pass over me, gently hitting my cheek with its tail. It was gone before I could grab it, but once again, for the first time, I knew that it would come back. It had responded to the stakes. I sped the rest of the way home, eager and gleeful to see which way the story would unfold. Would the hero pass the test, or would he fall into darkness? I didn't know. I couldn't wait to find out. I nearly knocked down my front door in a rush to get to my desk. I didn't even bother to turn on any lights as I thundered upstairs and down the hall to my bedroom, all the way in the back. I even tripped over my cat, who was so startled by the change in my normally lethargic state that he was caught in a panic trying to figure out which way to run. Once I was in my bedroom, I lit a candle, opened my laptop, and felt all the momentum drain from the tip of my fingers. What was I going to write about? I hadn't had a single idea on my way home, but I'd felt them swimming around. They'd called out to me again and again, "Come to me, take me, expose me to the world." For the first time, they wanted me, but they were teasing little things, and now that it was time to get to business, they were hiding. It didn't bother me, though. I'd heard the whole spiel before. You had to start writing, and the story would come. So that's what I did, and they did start to come. I could feel them again, little threads brushing my cheeks, my arms, my hands, but I couldn't see them. They kept hiding just beyond the veil of reality. I could almost hear them laughing at me like little sprites, making childish bets among themselves about how long I would keep trying until I gave up for the last time. Well, I wasn't going to give up, I decided with a huff, but suddenly the stakes didn't feel so thrilling anymore. Instead, the reality of what I'd promised inflated in front of me, and I realized that I was going to tell a story one way or another, and I didn't want to tell the story I'd leveraged as collateral. But I didn't have a different story to tell, and I wasn't sure how long it would take me to make one, if I was even capable. But that didn't really matter, did it? This was going to end, one of two ways. I drummed my fingers on the desk for a while. Then I typed in random keys until I had a page full of J3R, 3R, 9S, and other random characters. But that didn't turn into a story, so I opted for a classic, Once Upon a Time. What came after that? I wasn't sure. I kept fidgeting with different things on my desk until my candle started to sputter, and I looked up to find that the wick was drowning in melted wax. I'd been sitting here wrestling with my ideas for hours, and all I had was a page full of random letters and numbers. I put my hands on my knees, preparing to stand up. Then I remembered my ultimatum. I wasn't ready for that yet. I'd felt the idea swimming by just hours earlier in the car. This was my chance to pin them down, and I wasn't about to get up, no matter how bored or hungry or thirsty or hopeless I felt. Plus, I didn't particularly want to die. I'd just said it because it felt story-like, and I hoped it would kickstart my creativity. With that in mind, I settled back down and tried to start my first sentence. I wrote, deleted, wrote again, and till I lost count. Finally, I had a first sentence when my eyes were starting to seriously droop, and the yawn became more and more frequent. I looked at my watch. It was 2 o'clock in the morning, far past my bedtime, but I was starting to feel it again, the wisp of a story thread brushing my cheek. I had a first sentence, and it was time to get to work. I kept writing. The progress was faster than ever before. By 4 a.m. I had 2 pages. By 5, I had half of another. But by 5:15, I was starting to slow down. My head was bobbing back and forth, and every few minutes I would wake up, surprised that I'd fallen asleep. I tried my best to look at the screen, but it was blurry. So blurry that I couldn't even read the words. It was time to go to sleep. I stood up and my legs gave out, sending me elbow first onto my desk. But I didn't feel it. The only thing I felt was joy. I'd done it. I had an idea. By this time, I didn't even know what it was about anymore, but I had an idea. I stumbled back down the hallway to the kitchen to get a glass of water. My cat protested loudly. He might have been hungry, but I couldn't really tell. I'd kept my door closed the entire time I'd been writing, so I hadn't seen him much. In the kitchen, I filled a glass of water and was halfway through gulping it down when I froze, letting the rest dump down my chest. "Peekaboo," slithered a dark, playful voice from the shape that had frozen mid-gulp. "Giving up so soon, are you?" I stared back at the 2 shining eyes, the only indication that something had been sitting on the couch in the first place. The shape stood and walked towards me, with a slow, deliberate pace. The next great American author, standing in his kitchen, a brilliant book sitting on his screen, just waiting to be finished, but he's ready to call it quits. By now, the figure was on the edge of the shadowed, carpeted square that made up my living room. He took another step, exposing a long, thin, suited leg. "Ah, it's 'cause you don't remember me, do you?" With that, the figure stepped out into the slat of gray morning light, making its way into the kitchen by the window. I stumbled backwards at the sight, but there wasn't far to go. My back was already against the sink. The thing that stepped out was no man, though that was the closest description anyone would have given. It was tall and skinny, almost to a sickly point. It wore a suit that was at least one size too big, so that the shoulders were too wide, the jacket too baggy, the sleeves too long, and the pants fell in rolls of fabric at his shoes. The only thing remotely normal about it was its face, which had the uncanny look of someone who could only be human, but on the very verge of being called so. It had a sharply contrasted jawline, huge cheekbones, overly tight lips, and sharp, bright eyes. Besides the thin, stringy hair that fell over its shoulders in unkempt, flat locks, the smile was the most memorable feature. It was a smart smile, devious and genuinely malicious, the kind of smile you'd see before someone completely innocent gets unfixedly hurt. "How are you gonna do it, Nathan? I've been sitting on the couch, brimming with ideas." "Oh, I'm sorry. Was that insensitive? What I mean is that you have options. You're clearly ready to exercise them, since you're in here. Come, sit down with me and we'll talk them out. I'm thinking grand." It gestured with a long, outstretched arm, motioning as if it wanted to put its arms around me and guide me like a friend. "Remember, this is your story moment." By this point, I had already backed myself onto the corner without realizing it, and now I must have looked like I was trying to pack myself into one of the cabinets. "Nathan," it started again, taking another step forward. Forgive me. My manners astound me sometimes. I didn't introduce myself." It bit its bottom lip and flashed its same grin. "My name is Promise." I leapt back down from the counter and sprinted down the hallway, where I threw the door closed and jumped onto my bed. Promise's chuckle echoed down the hallway. "I guess you're gonna keep working on that story, huh?" it called after me. I was nearly hyperventilating when I sat down at my desk again, but at least my eyes weren't blurry anymore. My mind and body were wide awake, although I wasn't entirely sure what had just happened was real. But what else could it have been? I asked myself sharply. Something was in my house. Something had been sitting on my couch, mocking me. Something that wasn't entirely human had just introduced itself to me. And it knew about my ultimatum, my promise. I breathed out, putting my face in my palms. It knew about my promise. I sat there with my head in my hands for a few minutes before I calmed down enough to think. I had two options: finish my story or run. I wasn't sure that running would help, so I slid off the bed and walked back over to my desk. I scrolled back up to the top of the page and started to read so I could get back on track. As soon as I started, a guttering emptiness spread from my stomach to my throat. The story that I'd been working on for nearly 12 hours was awful. The core idea, exploring the daily life of a man who's haunted by his childhood emotional neglect, was boring. The entire 3 pages were nothing but me spinning my wheels, writing about a man whose life was so dull that no one would want to read him anyway. I wanted to cry, but the tears wouldn't come. Instead, I felt the breathless weight of fear. Promise was waiting. Promise was eager for me to come out again, because he must know. He must know that my story was flat. He must know that my character was lifeless. He must know that I had no story kernel or any other idea that the other writers were always seeming to have. He could probably read my story right now, I thought with wild certainty. And it was no longer curiosity or creativity that drove me to my keyboard. Instead, it was wild desperation. In one move, I selected all the text and deleted it. When I tried to settle in, my breath was too heavy, and I could feel it. I knew he was there. Whether he was sitting on the couch or leaning against the door, I knew he was there. All I knew was he could hear the click-clack of the keys and the bang-bang of my heart. I was sure he could even hear my thoughts, and so I screamed as loud as I could in my head, "Not done, not done, not done," until my inner ear felt like it was bleeding and blunted. And then I was exhausted again. No energy, no ideas, just an ever-dulling knowledge that I had to finish this story. That's when I saw them. I looked down at the clock in the corner of my screen to check the time before getting back to work. It was 7:42. Morning sunlight was dancing through my window, and it caught something and sent a dazzling rainbow all around the room. It was gone in a moment, but I turned all around to look for it, and found it circling my head in wispy motions. A translucent butterfly with long threads hanging at the ends of its wings. As it flew around my head, the threads tickled my cheek, and I gasped. For the first time all night, it was my turn to smile. I'd made it through the night and been rewarded. An idea had graced me, a sacred muse in the form of a butterfly. My smile grew, and suddenly there were more flashes of light, more and more swimming in the air, catching the sunlight and sending dazzling refracted rainbows of light all around the room, directly into my eyes. So this was what it was like. So many of them at once, at least 50 ideas kissing my head with their threads. I'd waited my entire life. I'd prayed for this, sacrificed for this, but clearly I'd never sacrificed enough. Whoever'd been listening had needed more to send me a muse, and my life and the balance had been enough. I was ready, so I reached out and cupped my hand around the random butterfly, breathing deeply of its golden light, ready for ideas to flow through my nostrils and into my soul. But the moment I touched it, the butterfly disappeared as if it had never been. I sat back, shocked, then I inched my hands towards each other, ready to cup it and breathe it in, but it also disappeared as if it had never existed. I tried a third, and then, getting desperate, I tried to pluck a fourth out of the air. Both disappeared as soon as I touched them. Hot, heavy rage rose in my stomach. I plucked at another, and it was gone. I swung my head forward and tried to breathe in the group, but all I met was empty air. I slammed my hands together over a solitary tenth and opened them to find nothing but stinging red skin. Every time they disappeared in front of me, the butterflies would appear again in my peripheral vision, and they would multiply. Eventually, it became more detrimental to try to catch them, and I dropped into my chair and looked at my screen. By then, I could barely look at it for all the bright butterflies circling my head. But I had to. I hadn't forgotten who was out there, waiting in the shadows of the curtains I'd left drawn over the windows. I went on working like this for another 12 hours. I had to squint at my screen just to see, and I wrote and deleted more times than I could count. Eventually I started drifting off, and by 12 p.m. my eyes were screaming for a break, my bladder crying for relief, and my parched throat felt like it cracked with every breath. But I couldn't step outside the room until it was done. So I stood up and danced with the butterflies. I couldn't touch them, but at least dancing would show them I cared. I stumbled back and forth across the floor, falling into the vase I kept by my desk and sending it shattering to the carpet. I had an incredible, deep, shattering noise as pieces of porcelain rocketed across the room. My eyes must have grown as wide as the windows. At least that's how they felt to me, because it was perfect. It was perfect for my story. I rushed through the broken mess back to my desk and slammed myself into the seat. I pressed enter on the keyboard and started typing my next line. I wasn't exactly sure what the story was about, but I was certain this was the one. I opened my eyes and the butterflies were gone. I sat up straight, drawing in breath sharply as I looked at the clock. 12:07. I'd accidentally slept for 7 minutes. Incensed, I balled up my fists and hit myself in the head. Stupid. I had work to do. I had to stay awake. If I went for long enough without working, he would... I saw his eyes looking in through the cracked door and watched as his emotionless face erupted in a grin. "Quitting time?" he asked, poking a finger through the door. I pushed myself out of the side of my chair and fell tailbone first on the floor. "Don't worry, Nathan. I'm just checking on you. I heard that awful crash, and then there was silence. I was beginning to think something might have happened to you. I couldn't let that happen. That's my job. But you have to make the call. Though, guessing by how long you've been in here at this, I don't think there's much time left. Maybe I should wait close by." He pushed the door the rest of the way open with his pointed finger and strolled into the room, crunching the remaining vase shards under his shoeless feet. He sat down on the bed, sat with his feet crossed like a child, and winked before the emotionless look returned to his face. I couldn't take it anymore. Promise or not, this wasn't the story I'd wanted. Suddenly I was aware of a bulge of car keys in my left pocket and the mass of my wallet in my right. In what felt like one movement, I stood, yanked the door open, and tore down the hall, down the steps, out the front door and into my car. I'd left my shoes, kicked off under the desk, but I didn't care. Couldn't even bring myself to look up to see if he was following me. I had put my car in reverse and backed out of the driveway as fast as I could. I nearly dropped the transmission out of the car, slamming it into drive. I made it to a hotel on the other side of town. I must have scared the receptionist half to death with my bloody feet and bloodshot eyes, but she gave me a room, so I didn't care. Inside, I shuffled to the bed, closed my eyes, and fell onto the sheets face first. Click. I squeezed my eyes shut, racing towards sleep. Squeak. I was almost there. I could feel reality falling and twisting away, but I wasn't fast enough. "All out of ideas," he crooned. I reluctantly opened my eyes to find his mere inches away from mine. I will never tell my parents how my grandparents really died. They wouldn't believe me if I did anyway. You may not either. About a month ago, I had just gotten out of class when I checked my phone. To my surprise, it was a voicemail from my father. Sure, Mom would call me from time to time since I left for college, but when I saw that my dad had called, I knew it was bad news. I just didn't know how bad at the time. "Son, we're buying you a plane ticket. You need to fly home right away. There's been an incident. Call me when you get this." That was all the voicemail said. I called them, and he explained that my grandfather had been killed in an accident with a combine while harvesting his corn. That the shock had killed my grandmother and caused her to have a heart attack as well. The flight was nerve-wracking. I've never done well in small spaces. I couldn't smoke on the flight, which made it even worse. I spent the whole flight fidgeting and walking back and forth to the restroom, even though I didn't need to go. I just needed to move around. My dad was already waiting for me when I landed, which ruined my plans of sneaking a cigarette before he showed. He gave me a hug and helped me load my bags in the car. I decided I needed a cigarette bad enough to light one up in the parking garage. My dad had never seen me smoke, and I tried to act as casual as I could about it. He raised an eyebrow as he closed the trunk. I waited for a lecture or an outburst, but all he said was, "That's a nice lighter." I hadn't realized I was still fidgeting with it. I handed him the vintage trench lighter. Ellen, my girlfriend, bought it for me a few weeks ago. Found it at an antique store in Seattle. He took it in his hand and looked at it approvingly. Then he handed it back. "No smoking in the car. Your mother'd never let us hear the end of it." My headache was gone by then, and I had a sufficient amount of nicotine in my system. I threw the cigarette down and stomped on it with my foot. An hour later, we were back at my parents' house, my mother greeting me with a hug. Then she stepped back and looked me up and down. "Your father used to smoke menthols too when he was your age," she said, giving my father a smirk. I wasn't sure if I was embarrassed that she'd caught me or surprised that Dad used to smoke. He gave me a pat on the shoulder and walked me into the house. We spent that night catching up on what I'd been doing since I was in college. They filled me in on how their business was struggling, but they were keeping their head above water. And then eventually, my dad filled me in on the details of the funeral. They had decided to do a closed casket on both my grandparents. The injuries to my grandfather had apparently been too gruesome for an open casket. They did a closed casket for my grandmother so that people would ask why. The next morning, we attended the funeral. There were only a few people there. My grandparents were in their 80s and had very few friends that were still around. Afterwards, we went back to my parents' house and ate. "Son, your mother and I have talked about it. We need to sell your grandparents' farm. We've neither the time or the money for upkeep. If you can take a week off of school and clean the place up, get it ready to sell, we will give you 25% of whatever we get from the sale." I took a large bite of chicken and chewed it over as I thought. I could call the school and explain the situation, and I could easily catch up later. "Yeah, I can do that. But what do you mean, clean it up? How bad is it?" My mother and father exchanged a worried look before she looked back at the plate. "Just before your grandparents passed, your grandmother called me. She told me that your grandfather had been diagnosed with dementia. Between that and their diminishing health, I suspect that the property's in pretty bad shape." "You haven't been out there?" I asked. It wasn't more than a couple of hours away. I couldn't believe they hadn't visited. Mom replied in a defensive tone. "We've both been working 7 days a week at the shop. We had to let our employees go. Business is not going too well." I nodded and asked what the plan was. "I'll drive you out there tomorrow. You can stay until I pick you up Friday. That gives you 6 days to get everything boxed up. I already ordered the boxes. They'll be delivered tomorrow." The following day, my father drove me up to the old farm. I spent a few weekends there as a kid. The place always had a creepy vibe, but it was fun. I could walk through the corn all day and never reach the end. As we pulled up, I saw a large scarecrow that stood over the corn at the edge of the field. "When did they get that thing?" I asked. Dad didn't answer. Instead, he looked at it out of the corner of his eye. His face contorted into a look of intense worry, maybe even fear? I couldn't tell. As we passed the scarecrow, I looked back. The wind hit it just right for a second, and I could have sworn it turned its head to watch us. About 20 minutes after he dropped me off, I was still wandering through the house, evaluating the countless knickknacks and pictures, trying to decide what should be kept, what should be sold, and what should be tossed. The phone rang and my heart skipped a beat. It's been so long since I've heard a landline ring, I thought it might be a fire alarm. "This is Jim. I'm the delivery guy getting the boxes you ordered, but my GPS doesn't work out here. Can you give me directions?" the man asked as I answered the phone. "Head down the old country road about 5 miles. Make a right at the dirt road," I said, trying to think of any other landmarks I could give this guy. "You'll see a scarecrow. Make a right at that scarecrow." The man thanked me and hung up. About a half hour later, I was washing dishes in the sink and cleaning up the kitchen. My grandmother must have set out lunch before the accident, because there were 2 plates of food on the table. It was so rotten I couldn't even tell what it was anymore. The pungent smell of mold and rotten food was making me gag, so I had to open the kitchen window. I listened to the wind chimes on the porch and found it rather relaxing. I began to wonder how many summer days my grandparents had spent out on the porch, sipping sweet tea and listening to the wind. Over the wind chimes, I heard a scream from the field. I shut off the water and listened closer. I heard the scream again, almost as if someone was howling in pain. I rushed outside and stood at the edge of the corn. My grandfather had waited too long to harvest his crops. The sun had bleached the corn until it was now the color of bone. The stalks waved back and forth in the wind, the dry leaves rustling against each other as they swayed. I heard the noise again and began to walk out into the field towards the noise. "Hello!" I yelled. I passed row after row of maize, looking left and right in the 8 inches of space between each row. And then in the distance, I saw a figure move. I began to run after it. I caught a glimpse of the figure every few seconds as the wind allowed. After a while, I lost sight of it. I ran faster and faster, trying to catch up with whatever it was, and then I ran full speed into the scarecrow. The straw-filled body did little to dull the impact with the wooden post it was mounted on. I fell onto my back, grabbing my nose as I could feel my palm immediately filling with warm blood. I sat up and felt dizzy, my head throbbing with each beat of my heart. When I finally was able to stand up, I looked up at the scarecrow. It was probably 7 feet tall, and then another 2 feet off the ground. It was dressed in blue overalls and red flannel. The head was a burlap bag with thick red string stitching its jagged mouth and big black buttons sewn on its eyes. It was topped with a straw hat stitched with the same red string used for the mouth. The thing was pretty intimidating at 6'2". Those crows must have been terrified, I thought to myself. I pinched my nose to stop the bleeding and began to look around. I saw this scarecrow when we pulled in. There was no way I made it to the road already. I tried to hop up and see over the corn. I couldn't see anything but more corn, all the way to the horizon. As my feet hit the ground, my head felt like it might pop. Thick blood began to flow more quickly from my nose. I pinched my nose and held my head back, facing to the sky to stop the bleeding. At the corner of my eye, that's when I saw it. The scarecrow had turned his head to face me. I turned to face the oversized doll and figured it must have been the wind again. For a second, we made eye contact. The big button eyes seemed to be looking right at me. I told myself I was being ridiculous. It was the wind that had moved the head. It was just a bag filled with straw. It was just the wind blowing the stalks, and I imagined it had made them look like a figure running. It had even been the wind that was howling as it passed through the leaves. But still, as I stared at it, I knew it was staring back. The hair on my arm was beginning to rise, making my arms tingle. My heart began to quicken, and then the scarecrow abruptly lifted its head and looked back over the field, staring. I ran as fast as I could in the opposite direction. I stole short glances over my shoulder as I pushed through the corn. All I could see was a path of broken stalks behind me. Soon I heard a rumbling noise behind me. A truck, I thought. I kept pushing on, my lungs beginning to burn with effort. My foot caught in a shallow irrigation ditch and sent me tumbling onto the dirt driveway. The driver of the truck locked up his brakes, skidding past me as he missed me by an inch. I laid there in the dust for a few seconds. The driver got out of the truck. "What is wrong with you?" he asked. His tone was harsh and angry. I stood up to face him. He was in his mid-40s with a big beard and an even bigger beer belly. "I'm sorry, I lost my footing," I said, looking back into the field, expecting to see the monster coming out to chase me again. The man followed my gaze into the field and then looked back at me. "You high, boy?" he asked seriously. I stopped myself. Telling him I was being chased by a scarecrow would only reinforce that accusation. I hit my head pretty hard. I said, placing a hand on my nose again. The driver nodded, then offered me a ride back to the house. I would have been here earlier if you knew how to give directions. There weren't no scarecrow at the road, he said. We pulled up to the house and began unloading the boxes he came to deliver. I'll be back Friday to pick them up once they're full. Your dad booked a storage shed on the other side of town. You have about 200 square feet, so keep that in mind as you pack, he said. He stared into the field. My daddy was a corn farmer in the next county. He didn't do half as well as you did here. Actually, now that I think about it, I drove past this place last year. I remember they had a rough crop. Do you know what they did different this year? The driver asked. No, I'm sorry, I have no idea, I answered. He nodded and spit. Well, take care of yourself. I'll see you on Friday. With that, he left. I went inside and grabbed a clean shirt. I washed the blood off my hands and face in the bathroom and changed. I tried to shake off the incident with the scarecrow. I must be more stressed out with the loss of my grandparents than I realized. I needed a distraction and began to pack the office downstairs. I was putting papers in a trash bag when I came across a letter my grandmother had written. Son, I need some help with your father. The dementia's getting worse. The last 2 days he's been raving like a lunatic. This spring a man came by and offered us a scarecrow as a gift. He said it did wonders for his crops and wanted to pay it forward. Your father told him no at first, thinking the man was a swindler, but he insisted he didn't want anything in return. Your father is now convinced that the scarecrow is the reason we had such a great crop this year, but the scarecrow won't let him harvest it. I left you several voicemails about this and you haven't called me back, so I thought I would write you. Please, come help. I'm worried about your father. Mom. I put the letter down and sat in the office chair. I could dismiss my experience with the scarecrow as just stress or an overreactive imagination, but my grandfather having similar worries about the same scarecrow? What are the odds, I thought to myself. I needed a cigarette. I went outside to the porch and lit one. I took a long drag before exhaling. A cool breeze blew by, bringing the wind chimes to life. I turned around to look at them and see if one would be worth keeping. That's when I saw it. The scarecrow was just 20 feet away in the field. It hung on its post, staring at me. While I was trying to process this, it fell down. Well, more like hopped down. Immediately the post went up and then disappeared into the field. It couldn't be alive, I thought to myself. Seconds later, the scarecrow came out of the corn. It began running across the lawn, carrying the 10-foot post like a Trojan soldier running with a spear. The scarecrow launched the post. It sailed across the yard and missed me by a foot. It took down the wind chimes and impaled the wall behind me. I turned to run inside, but the post was now blocking my entrance. I hopped the rail on the porch and ran towards the old barn. I could hear the scarecrow running behind me, gaining on me, the straw rustling under his overalls and flannel. Once I was inside the barn, I tried to close the door, but it stuck fast from years of neglect. I grabbed the closest thing I could find as a weapon, a pitchfork. The scarecrow entered the room. Its jagged mouth and button eyes now seemed much more menacing as it marched towards me. I rammed the pitchfork into its chest as hard as I could. It pierced deep into its body easily, but it seemed to have no effect. With its left hand, or burlap mitten really, it grabbed my arm. The thing was impossibly strong. It used its right hand to pull the pitchfork out and then turned it towards me. I struggled uselessly against its grip. I desperately searched my pocket for something I could use as a weapon. I took my lighter out and flipped the top open. The flame caught almost instantly. In seconds, the scarecrow was fully engulfed. I let him go and fled into the field. The field was burning in less than an hour. The fire department said it was overly dry because it wasn't harvested on time. They didn't really have any interest in investigating the matter further. My father saw the post stuck in the wall when he picked me up. I knew he recognized it as the scarecrow's post because he didn't ask any questions about how it had gotten thrown through the wall and how the field had burned down. I know on some level he suspected the scarecrow killed his parents. I know on some level that he's grateful I killed it. But I know we will never discuss it because people would think we were crazy. My mother used to tell me stories of sirens. Specifically, the sirens that lived in the lake near the lodge up in Fairbank that her family had owned for a long time. The lodge itself was a bit secluded, almost fully hidden behind an acre of forest. There was one road leading in and out, where the lodge and the lake sat. To be fair, the path we took was more dirt than road, and it was about a 20-minute drive to the nearest town. We went there every summer while I was growing up, and I always tried my best to search for the sirens my mother talked about. She told me time and time again that it was rare to catch such a supernatural sighting. But when the sky rains down and the winds are swift, you might be able to hear them. They sing above the whistle of the air, crying their blessing to the heavens above that water their lake, nourishing their home with its tears, she would say, her eyes glassy as she spoke, a small, serene smile playing over her lips, as if she was replaying a memory in her head. This, however, was not a satisfactory enough answer for an overly curious mind, and during every visit I would grab my scuba goggles and search the waters as much and as long as I could. I was never able to get too far down below the inky darkness was all that I could see, though, the deeper water far too out of reach from the sunlight above. My father, well, he had no time for such nonsense. He would roll his eyes and scoff any time Mother would begin her stories. It would make her brow crinkle, not at all happy with his mockery of the story passed down to her from her mother. However, as I grew older, so too did his annoyance with these so-called fairy tales my mother spun. He'd tell her I was getting too old to believe in such things, that her stories were nothing but bedtime tales for young children. This became one of the many arguments that they had throughout their marriage as time went on. As the years continued to go by, their relationship only seemed to get worse, and I was becoming aware of it quickly. There was always this tenseness that hung heavy in the air whenever they would be in the room together for too long. I would have been too young, but I wasn't blind or stupid. I didn't know exactly why their marriage was deteriorating, and I never thought to ask, as it seemed more like grown-up problems that I wouldn't be able to understand. Maybe over all those years, they had both just become different people, different than they had been when they'd first met, and they were no longer on the same page when it came to life goals. I don't know. Slowly, their disdain for each other became harder and harder to hide from me, though. I could sometimes hear them at night, fighting with each other in the late hours, hushed whispers laced with poison that would leak into my ears through the thin walls of the house. They never knew I listened, and I never said anything as they continued their charade, as if I couldn't see the cracks forming between them. That was another reason I loved the lodge. It was the only place that they never argued, either in front of me or in their room. It was our vacation away from the stresses of the monotony of life. Perhaps it was even a silent agreement between them. When they were at the lodge, they were happy. We were a happy family, or at least we pretended to be. And for a long time, I was okay with pretending we were happy too. The first time I saw a siren on the lake was the day before my mom died. She and Dad had gone for a hike through the forest up in the hills by the cliffs, and I had opted to stay behind. Maybe I'll take a look for sirens again, I joked. Although at 15, I'd given up looking for them a long time ago. I was growing up, after all, and despite my love of my mother's stories, even I was growing to doubt their validity. Dad sighed in annoyance, and Mom put a placating hand on his shoulder to try and ease his frustration. "Well, if you find one, I'd love to hear the story when we get back. We should be in well before the storm is supposed to be this evening," Mom had said with a grin. I waved them goodbye as they started their trek and watched them slowly disappear from view as they were swallowed up by the woods surrounding the lake. The sun had been above the trees when they had left. An hour later, when the storm began to quickly move in, they had not yet returned. I was starting to get worried. The wind had become a real tempest out there. I could hear the wailing gusts as they began to whistle over the lodge. The rain began to slap hard against the roof of the lodge as the downpour grew worse. The sky was growing even darker by the minute. I stood to watch at the window, looking for any signs of my parents. Then the lightning struck, lighting the entirety of the ground, yet still no sign of them. I went to the landline, but just as I picked up the phone, the power went out. I tried to phone anyway, but it was dead. My heart began to race, and I panicked, wondering what to do. I could go to the car, go for help in town. I didn't know how to drive, though, but I'd risk it. I knew the way to town, at least. I could get the police and round up a search party. With my mind made up, I grabbed my parka off the coat rack and Dad's keys from the other side, getting ready to face the onslaught of wind and rain that I was sure I'd be fighting every second on the way there. I was running down the front steps to the porch towards Dad's car when I first heard it. It made me stop, dead in my tracks, and I wondered for the briefest second if I was imagining things. High above the screaming wind, there was another sound, an ethereal bell-like ringing dancing across the air. Or was that the sound of someone singing? I slowly turned towards the sound coming from the lake, my heart beating like a drum in my chest, my breath catching quickly in my throat. And there she was, the obsession of my childhood, the creature of the stories I had heard about for so long. I could see her, even through the darkness of the storm. She was above the water from the waist up, the rest of her body hidden below the shadows of the lake. The lightning scattered around the sky in quick succession, showing brief glimpses of the siren's full body in bits and pieces. Mother had said long ago that sirens were not the way they were in the storybooks. They were not beautiful maidens with long, shining hair and warm, supple skin. They looked like the creature before me now. She had no hair at all. Her head was bare and smooth like the rest of her from what I could see. She had chalk-white skin and black, beady eyes that stared me down as she sang. Her lips were thin and horrifyingly wide. She had 2 long rows of teeth that were white as bone, and every single one of them was sharply pointed, almost reminding me of a shark. I'd always expected to be excited if I ever caught a glimpse of a siren, despite being warned of their appearance. But this feeling that was creeping through me was like ice. That wasn't excitement. It was slow dread that was growing and pooling in my stomach as I stared, frozen in place by her song. A dull numbness began to set in, and the sound of the wind began to fade into the background, leaving nothing behind but the beautiful bell-like song. I could feel myself walking away from the car and towards the edge of the lake. I was caught by the bait of her song, and had gotten trapped in the dark abyss of her eyes. A siren's beauty does not come from her body alone. She sings to make you look, and when she catches your eye, that's what ensnares her human prey. Mother would say, snapping her fingers in my face. She would even eat me? I'd asked. Mother had shaken her head, smiling. No, my dear. Not these sirens, at least. Not the ones in our lake. These sirens are different. They will not harm someone of our family line, for we are the ones who brought them here so long ago. We're bound to each other, us and them. She would say that last part in a whisper, as if it was a secret. Maybe it was, as she never spoke about it again. But even now, even remembering her words, I felt a shiver of doom crackle through me as I got closer. The singing got louder, higher, shriller, until it was all I could hear. There was no wind, no rain, no thunder, just her song. I could see her better now as I trudged into the lake, my legs moving forward with a mind of their own. Her skin was like leather. I could see the gums around her white, jagged teeth, and they were all black as coal. Her fingers were long and thin, ending in black, sharp, needle-like points. She looked like my worst nightmare come to life, but still, I couldn't pull myself away from her eyes. Her damn eyes. I wanted to scream. I wanted to cry, to run, but I was at the mercy of this thing. I guess it's true what they say. Be careful what you wish for. Her song stopped mid-note when I finally stepped within her reach. A long, spindly arm snapped out to grab my left wrist, and she lifted it to my line of sight before lifting her other hand and plunging a long black thumbnail into my wrist. Sirens can tell us the future, I remembered, my 10-year-old self asking with excitement. Mother hushed me, for it was long past bedtime, but I had begged for just one more fact that she knew about the sirens. Yes, and no. They can't see all, only bits and pieces that don't change no matter what we do or try to prevent it, Mother explained. I held on to that memory even as the shock of pain webbed up through my arm, through my chest, and then into my head. I could see it, what the siren had wanted to share with me, the reason she had called me into the darkness. I screamed, and then it was over. I don't know how long I sat there in the dirt and the mud, the water of the lake gently lapping around my waist as I stared out into the slow, waning storm. The wind had slowed, the rain had gentled, and with the chaos of Mother Nature's ever-changing mood slipping away from whence it came, the siren too disappeared with it, slipping back into the lake without a sound or a ripple, as if she had never been there at all. Heavy footsteps pulled me from my revelry, and I didn't need to turn to see it was my dad, nor did I need to look to know he was alone. When I finally turned to look up at that looming, soaking figure, his face was grim, and his hands were shaking. They'd lost track of the time and had gotten caught at the beginning of the storm. The darkness had overwhelmed them quickly, and even with their flashlights, it was a treacherous journey they had to make back down the trail as they came. Mother had walked a bit too close to the edge of a cliff, and the mud had given way under her steps. Then she fell. Just like that, she was gone. My father was quiet for a while after that. Even at her funeral, he was stoic and cold. I overheard some of the adults talking amongst themselves, telling each other how sad it was that she was gone, and how my father had to be strong for me. We didn't talk much after that day, and we didn't go back to the Fairbanks Lodge for a long time after that either. I never told him what I saw. I knew he'd never believe me anyway. I didn't go back again until I was 19. I took Mom's ashes with me, and I made sure to check the weather report on my app before I went. I waited and bided my time until I knew that it was just the right time. Then I called my dad. I told him I wanted us to spread Mom's ashes in the lake, and I wanted him to be here. He seemed resistant at first, but after a few minutes of begging, he relented. The wind was beginning to gust just as I saw the Jeep pulling up to the lodge. Rain was beginning to pour down harder when he got out. He was running up towards the porch in an attempt to escape the onslaught of the rain. When he stopped, he could hear it in the wind, the beginning of her song. I stood resolutely on the porch, making a point to avoid the view of the lake to my side. I saw him turn to look, and snap, he was snared. I watched him walk to the shoreline, and I watched him walk into the water. I watched until his head disappeared under the waves of the lake, following the heavy, dangerous voice and eyes of the creatures that lived below the darkness of the water. That day, the first day I ever saw a siren, my mom died, but not because she slipped. I know that because I know how she died. The siren showed me. She showed me how my parents began to fight on their hike, a fight bigger than I'd ever seen them have before. She showed me how in a fit of rage, my father had pushed my mother. He pushed her right off that cliff and to her death below, just as I now sent him to his death below. Like father, like daughter, I guess. I finally allowed myself to look towards the lake, my face devoid of emotion, and I saw her that one last time, the siren who snared me so long ago and had let me go. For I was bound to her, and she was bound to me, and she would not harm me, for I was my mother's blood. The same could not be said of my father. She gave me a subtle nod before disappearing beneath the waves again, leaving no evidence of either her or her visit, except the perfectly round white scar that I would bear on my left wrist until the day I met my end. I sighed as the storm continued to howl around me, creating a whistling sound as it ascended to the sky overlooking Fairbank Lodge. Or is that the sound of someone singing, perhaps? I always knew there was some aspect of my life that was cursed. I tried to be reasonable about it, just assuming that I was making bad decisions. But there's only so much tragedy one can take as misfortune. I had more than my fair share in the past 20 years. It started with the birth of my son, David. His mother, Camilla, the love of my life, she became a shell. After giving birth to David, something happened in her mind. Something broke. She lost the ability to speak instantly, and as years went by, she slowly forgot how to do many things. How to drive, how to read, how to dress herself, until she was finally stuck in a wheelchair. I say forgot because there was nothing wrong with her body. According to our doctors, her nerves, her organs, her muscles, everything was in perfect order. It was all just her mind. It was unlearning all that she learned since she was born. Memories and personalities took much longer to go. I could tell from the tears that she sometimes cried. When they stopped, I knew Camilla was mentally gone. That took about 10 years. It was enough to break me, but I didn't have the luxury of curling up into a fetal position and melting into a puddle for long. I had a son to raise. From day one, David was perfect. David could do no wrong in any aspect of his life. Incredibly intelligent, progressing faster in school than any of his classmates. It was nothing newsworthy. There had been greater child prodigies, but I think he was just holding back. He had this spark in his eye when confronted with a problem. It was a confidence and a hint of amusement that told me that he had the answer already. As for his behavior at home, he was a pillar of the family. No father should ever have to lean on his son so early in life, but that's what I did. He was a rock. That's why I never got in his way when he wanted to do something. I let him do as he pleased because I had no reason to doubt that he could look after himself. I expected some kind of ego to develop. I expected David to take advantage of me and my weak parenting, but he never did. David graduated from university at 18 and found a job almost immediately, thanks to some connections with other students. He was sending money home every month to pay for a caregiver who would look after Camilla. The caregiver being an ex-professor from his university. I assumed she was getting more money than what she was earning at the school. All those years, since the moment he could more or less look after himself, I heard the phrase, "Thank God you have David," from everyone who knew our family situation. You might even be thinking that right now, while reading this. Yet, I could never quite share that feeling. Without any real reason, I wasn't as happy with David as others were. He intimidated the hell out of me. He had this way of looking at me, reaching out with love, and even as his father, I could never make that connection. I couldn't even bring myself to like him. My son treated me better than any son had ever treated his father, and in my heart I felt the same way about him as I do about strangers I pass in an alleyway. I just wanted to keep my distance. That good he brought into my life should have helped me balance things out just a little bit, but tragedy always found me. I lost family. I lost friends. I watched my colleagues betray me and my work crumble. Even my pets didn't last long, so I stopped getting them. And although I never told anyone, I started to feel the reason for all of it was David. In my head, as damaged as it was, I blamed him. Not just for Camilla, but for everything. Everything. To see him leave the house was probably the happiest I'd been in a long time. That is until that caregiver he sent arrived, a month or so later. "Hi, Mr. Samuels," she said, walking into the house. "My name's Lilith Evans. I know your son, David." She shook my hand with a smile. My heart just about popped out of my chest when I saw her, this beautiful woman. I went cold again when she mentioned David. She didn't falter in her enthusiasm. Lilith explained why she was there, tears in her eyes when she spoke about how kind and amazing David was to care about his ailing mother. I don't think I said a word to her in our first meeting. I was too shocked, giving her hums and nods. I did speak to her the next day, but it was like speaking to David. I just ended up bending in her favor, letting her do what she would, taking care of Camilla and leaving me to my work. She had the same eyes as David, pouring with kindness, but for me, lacking any soul. I decided to give her the same treatment and just stay out of her way. "Mr. Samuels, we're leaving," she called to me from the front door. "Okay," I called just before she shut the door. Alone, Lilith was taking Camilla on a walk and had been doing so every day for the last 2 years. It hurt to say it like that, taking her for a walk, as if she was an animal to be looked after. Even now, with bitterness towards myself, I can't help but think it was a waste anyway. I focused on my work, and when I finished, I turned to the TV. It was good at distracting me and getting me away from my problems, from my feelings. I could go on a whole day feeling nothing, while something inside of me was begging to be resolved. I ignored it even then, staring at the mouths of actors I didn't know, trying to see how fake they were. I fell asleep. I woke up later, much later. The sun had settled and the room was dark. I had only the light from the TV to help me spot the furniture. Without a single question going through my mind, I went through the house, closing curtains, checking windows, locking doors. I grabbed a glass of water in the kitchen. I rubbed my eyes for too long, the light hurting them, so I just turned them all off. I would feel my way upstairs to the bedroom. There was a rail on one side of the stairs where Camilla's chair lift was mounted. My fingers traced along it. Something was wrong, but I didn't know what. Trudging into the bedroom, I saw my unmade bed in the nightlight coming from the window. The cool blue spoke to my heart, and I fell onto the sheets. It was perfect. I knew I could only enjoy it for a moment. I had to get dressed and close the curtains, but I argued with myself before I finally got up. The window gave me a clear view of the backyard, the adjacent lake, and, of course, the woods. I saw the neighbor's swing set moving slightly in the breeze. Not squeaking, thankfully. I had snuck over one night and oiled the chains. A light flickered among the trees. I looked at it, wanting to see something. A beam of light, a flashlight. It turned away and continued deeper into the woods, though. I thought it was more than likely my other neighbors, going after his dog again. It tended to escape, and I closed the curtains. When I turned around, I saw that the door to Camilla's bedroom across from mine was still open. Her wheelchair wasn't in the corner of the room, and Lilith usually closed it after putting Camilla to bed. I then realized what was wrong when I climbed the stairs. The chairlift was at the bottom. Lilith hadn't returned with Camilla after her walk. I immediately called Lilith's phone, but she didn't pick up. The phone would keep ringing, only to time out. That left only David. He picked up almost immediately. "David, Lilith hasn't come back with Camilla," I told him. "Mom's here with me. I wanted to see her. Did Lilith tell you this afternoon?" I was asleep, I stuttered, remembering telling Lilith not to wake me up when I was napping. Maybe she left me a note. I'm sorry. Why did you want to see your mother? He could tell I was tense, even though Camilla was mostly gone in my eyes. I still cared enough about her memory to want her to be safe. "Relax. I just wanted to," David explained in a calm voice. "I haven't seen either of you in 2 years. Just wanted to see Mom and Lilith while driving through the neighborhood." "Where in town?" Oh, Lionel Street, I think. No, where are you staying?" David gave me the address of a motel and told me he would come around in the morning if I was available. Of course, I said I was, and we ended the call shortly after that. I sat down at the end of my bed, fell back, and was asleep as my head hit the sheets. Looking back, I was stressed. David was back. "How's Aunt Grace?" David asked from the other side of the table. He held a cup of coffee with both hands as if warming them. He had a kind smile. "She passed away shortly after her husband," I said. "I tried not to think about losing my sister. About a week after you left." I said that last sentence with a little too much anger, but I tried to pass it off as sadness. David looked down, his face painted with concern. After a long moment, I finished my coffee, and David looked up again. His black hair had grown into flowing waves around his chiseled face. "I liked her," he said. I mumbled. "Where's Camilla?" "Lilith is looking after her." "Dad," David sighed, "do you want to see her? Do you want Lilith to bring her here?" I just want to know where she is." "Where else would she be?" It was a simple question. David was being reasonable. I just didn't like his attitude. Seeing him again put me on edge. Looking at him, I couldn't find a single fault. He had grown into a handsome young man, but he looked nothing like me. I didn't see any of my weakness in him. "Why are you back in town? Problems at work?" "No, work is good," David sighed again. "Speaking of work, I'll come back another time with Mom. You still have those meetings every Thursday, right?" I nodded. "Okay, I'll leave you to it then." David got up and left. I didn't follow. I listened to his footsteps and heard him close the front door. I let out a breath, something I'd been holding in longer than I felt I knew. My heart was pounding. I picked up my empty coffee cup and put it in the sink. I then walked over to grab David's. The cup was still scalding hot. I hissed and wiped my fingers. It had been over half an hour since I poured it, and it still hadn't cooled down. I dumped the hot contents and rinsed the cup out angrily. There was always something to send me over the edge. I ended up taking that cup out of the sink and throwing it as hard as I could into the trash, wanting it to break, but some other trash cushioned the fall. I spent the whole day staring at a whiteboard and a ream of paper on my desk. Markers were at hand. I needed to write something on the board, but I was too distracted. Being stuck in my head, I couldn't help but play out the talk I'd had with David. No matter which way I looked at it, I couldn't help but see myself as an asshole. I didn't really care about Camilla. I was happy seeing my son, and damn it, I respected him enough for sensing my discomfort and leaving when he did. "What the hell is wrong with me?" I murmured. "Seriously, I blinked and it was night again. I put the marker down and made my rounds. Curtains, windows, doors, finally ending up in my bedroom. I looked out at the lake. The swings were squeaking again. A breeze rustled the trees more than it disturbed the lake. I heard the familiar pitter-patter of droplets hitting the earth outside. Rain? Where are the clouds? I said to myself, looking up at the sky. I could see the stars. No rain on my house, and not a droplet hit my face, but I heard rain nonetheless. I looked down at the ground, but I couldn't see anything. Out of curiosity, but mostly escaping my own thoughts, I marched downstairs, seeing as I was already dressed, and opened the kitchen door to the backyard. The sound of rain was closer, but when I pointed my phone light at the ground, I didn't see anything. I then listened closer and realized the sound was coming from the nearby trees. It didn't sound like leaves. There was no way I was confusing the two. I walked over to the tree and was almost immediately soaked in water. I stepped back out of the downpour and turned on my phone light again. From the branches and the leaves, rain fell thick and fast. It pooled on the ground and soaked into the earth. The sight of it left me silent and thoughtless. When seeing something that just didn't make any sense, my mind struggled to try to make sense of it. What snapped me out of it was the sound my ears picked up amongst the patter. Crying. Weeping. Coming from the tree, so low and pathetic. It was the kind of moaning sob that only those who were grieving could make. It was how I cried the many nights that followed Camilla's degradation. Only that was a long time ago. Yet the thought of Camilla seemed to get the cogs in my mind moving again. I looked down at my phone and wiped a few stray droplets from the screen, hovering over David's number. I wanted to call him, but I knew no matter what he said, I would just want the call to end. Instead, I turned back to the house. The weeping followed me as I entered. Even when the sounds of the drops faded, those cries echoed. I got into my car and drove off the property, heading to the motel David was staying at. It probably sounded hypocritical for caring all of a sudden, but if you were confronted with trees that sounded like you in a moment where your heart was breaking, going to Camilla was the best thing on my mind. Arriving at the motel, I saw a few cars parked out front. One room had the lights on. I heard the TV playing through the thin walls. I could understand that. For some people, it was the only way they could get to sleep. I saw David's silver four-door parked in front of one of the dark rooms, so I assumed that it had to be his. Definitely not the best place to be looking after one's ailing mother, but I didn't care to question it until I was standing in front of the motel. I wanted to call Lilith and ask her what she was thinking leaving Camilla with David in such a place. But then I noticed her car was there as well. It made me angry. With a sudden wave of responsibility for my wife washing over me, I marched up to the door and thumped it with the meat of my hand. "David, it's me. Let me in, or... Jeremy?" It shattered everything inside of me. My heart felt so hollow that I thought it might collapse in on itself. My bones were glass, cracking under the weight of my flesh. I stepped back from the door and it opened. The light was on inside. Camilla was standing in the doorway, her body frail and skinny. Her eyes were wide and scared. I knew her body had wasted away, but it seemed to be less saddening when she was in a wheelchair. When she was standing and moving, she looked like a starving prisoner. Yet, I was the one who buckled first. She took a shaky step towards me and fell forward. I caught her in my arms and held her against me. She was so light. A bony hand reached up and touched the side of my head as I cried into her shoulder. As her fingertips graced my skin, there was a cold plunge and a sudden fall. It was the same sensation of suddenly falling into a dream and waking up. Only this time I was soaked in rain, kneeling in front of a dark, empty motel room. The door was open. Blood had stained the doorway. I was breathing with a burst of adrenaline. I was in danger, or at least I was a moment ago. I stood up quickly and stepped into the motel room. There was blood on the bed, the walls, the curtains. I could see the dark shapes of bodies on the ground and an empty wheelchair in the corner. I stepped out, unable to investigate any further. When I had the stomach for it, I trudged over to reception. I had to make a call. Camilla and Lilith's bodies were covered and carted away. Camilla was untouched, not a scratch on her. Same could not be said for Lilith. Her body was mutilated beyond recognition, but her wallet and car remained in the parking lot. It was safe to assume that it was her. David is the prime suspect in the investigation, although I don't hold much hope for that. It's only because I said so that he's being investigated at all, but the receptionist reports a different name, a different man entirely, renting that room at the motel. There was no record of David returning to town. Nobody to say he wasn't either, though. Lilith was the only real connection, but there was a problem with that as well. There was no transfer of money into her account from David, or anyone. She was a professor at his university, but he never took her class. Nobody there had ever seen the two of them speak. From the outside, it looked like a random person was playing caregiver for my wife, and I just went along with it. I didn't say anything about what I had seen before finding the bodies. I haven't told them about the ill feelings I had towards my son. It's It's better to leave as much of the unexplained out of my statement. Yet, I believe, since no one has found a reasonable explanation for what happened, mine is the only one that matters. Mine is the only one that pieces things together, that confirms the fears I have regarding my son. That there's something wrong with him. That he isn't the kind of man everyone thinks he is. Only, I'm too old, too afraid to do anything about it. I haven't had any communication with David since. I retired from my job last year, and I live alone.